All right, class, so welcome. We are in October 25th. We're in week 11 of our class. And week 11, we'll go through chapter 13, which is about blood vessels and circulation. And then this week in lab, you guys will have 2 lab activities, and both are on blood. The first lab activity will be a normal kind of Google lab activity where we'll send you the link. And then lab activity 11 will have to do with your home lab kit that you picked up last week. So you'll need your home lab kits today for lab. If for some reason you weren't able to get it, you'll miss out on 4 points, which isn't a super amount of points, so I wouldn't worry too much if you have to miss out on those points. So that's what we'll be doing in lab today. And then in lecture, we'll be going over chapter 13. Next week, so a week from today, so November 1st already, I can't believe that. You'll have your next lecture exam. So just keep that in mind. Next Monday will be your next lecture exam, but your next lab exam won't be for 2 more weeks still. So I just wanted to pull up this schedule to let you know that. All right. Any questions at all, guys? Okay, I'll go ahead and share our screen for chapter 13. So remember, we talked about blood, we talked about the heart, and now we're kind of finishing our circulatory system talk with blood vessels and circulation. So how blood now will circulate through the rest of your body. So we kind of are finishing up our circulation system talk here. All right, and we have the whole week to get through this PowerPoint. So we'll get through about 40 slides today, and then we'll finish on Wednesday. So blood vessels and circulation are very important. Our heart is important for pumping blood, but then we need a way for that blood to be transferred to the rest of the body. So we classify our blood vessels outside of the heart, and we divide them into 2 classes, pulmonary vessels and systemic vessels. And the pulmonary vessels will always transport blood from the right ventricle of the heart through the lungs and back to the left atrium. And the systemic vessels will transport blood from the left ventricle of the heart through all the parts of the body and then back to the right atrium. So we have kind of this pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit. If you're going to remember, the pulmonary circuit has to do with blood going to and from the lungs, and the systemic circuit has to do with blood going to and from the heart to all other parts of the body. So that's kind of one way we divide our blood vessels, the pulmonary blood vessels and the systemic blood vessels. Our functions of the blood vessels: they carry blood, they exchange nutrients, waste products, and gases within tissues at the capillary level, and we'll talk about what that is. They transport other substances, not just blood, like hormones. They regulate your blood pressure, so your blood vessels can get smaller, or they can constrict, or they can dilate to help regulate the blood pressure and blood flow. And they also direct blood flow to certain tissues. So your blood vessels have a way to constrict if they don't want blood to go to a certain part of the body, and then they'll dilate to allow or to shunt the blood to a different part of the body that needs it at the time, like your muscles that are exercising, or let's say your gut when you're trying to digest a big meal. So we have arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart, and they're usually much thicker with a lot of elastic so that they can kind of stretch and recoil. When the right or left ventricle pumps the blood out of the heart, the arteries can kind of stretch from that pumping action or the ejection of blood. And then veins carry blood to the heart, and they are thinner, let's get rid of that K, with less elastic. And then capillaries are where we have an exchange occurring between blood and tissue fluids. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back to the heart, and kind of where they meet in the middle are the capillaries, and we'll talk about that too. So the blood flow goes from arteries into arterioles, which are just smaller arteries. Arterioles eventually form capillaries, and then capillaries form venules, which are our smallest veins. Venules form small veins, and then small veins form regular size veins that return the blood to the heart. So that's the way that our blood flows through the body. We have 3 walls to our blood vessels, and we call them tunics. So it's a tunica for one of the layers of these blood vessel walls. The tunica intima is the innermost layer, and it's made of simple squamous epithelium. So this is the innermost layer of the blood vessel wall. So this would be the layer that's touching everything that's flowing through the blood vessel. The tunica media is the middle layer, and this will be the layer with your smooth muscle. So it'll have elastic and collagen fibers, so it can constrict or stretch or dilate that blood vessel. And then the tunica adventitia is the outermost layer that's just connective tissue. So here's a look at some differences of these tunics or blood vessel walls, and the differences between an artery, which is on the left, and a vein, which is on the right, and they're labeled A and V. And you can see that the arteries have much thicker tunica media layers, and that's because the arteries are really the ones that are going to allow the stretch and recoil and constricting and dilating. So they'll have the much thicker layers of those smooth muscles, whereas the veins have much thinner tunics or much thinner wall layers. And that's because veins they don't control the constriction and dilating or the blood pressure. Your veins more act as what we call a blood reservoir. So most of the blood in the body that's not in your arteries or heart is just kind of being held in veins as a reservoir. So the walls of the veins are much thinner. Different types of arteries. So our elastic arteries are the largest in the diameter. They have the thickest walls. And these are our great blood vessels. So the ones that are leaving the ventricles. So the aorta, that's leaving the left ventricle, and the pulmonary trunk, that's leaving the right ventricle. Those are our elastic arteries. The muscular arteries are medium to smaller in size. They have a they're thicker in diameter. They contain the smooth muscle cells, so they can control blood flow to the body regions when they constrict or dilate to kind of shunt the blood to where your body needs it. So here we have elastic arteries with a lot of elastic tissue and smooth muscle. And then the muscular arteries have a very thick tunica media layer with a lot of muscles. And that's because your muscular arteries are what will control the blood flow to the rest of the body. They will constrict and dilate to control blood pressure as well. Capillaries then, so blood flows from your arterioles, which are the smallest arteries, and then into the capillaries. And capillaries are kind of a branching network of blood vessels. So they kind of branch, they have incredibly thin walls, and the blood flow is regulated into these capillaries by smooth muscle cells, which we call precapillary sphincters. And those precapillary sphincters will just control the blood flow moving into the capillaries. So this is what a capillary network looks like, is shown in the middle here. And I told you before, the capillaries are kind of the connection between the arteries and the veins. So arteries, again, bring blood away from the heart. Eventually, blood needs to make its way back to the heart, and the capillaries are the connection piece. You can see here a change in color in the capillaries going from red to blue. And that's because usually within the capillaries, the walls are incredibly thin. So this is where your oxygen gets offloaded from the hemoglobin that's transporting it in the blood. So oxygen leaves and travels into the surrounding tissues where these capillaries are. So that's why we have a change in color from red to blue. Blue stands for deoxygenated blood after the blood or the oxygen has left the blood. And then the other side of the capillary will turn into the venule, which is the smallest vein that brings the deoxygenated blood then back to the heart. Also labeled here, we have these precapillary sphincters, which again are kind of just smooth muscle cells. And then again, they just control blood flow into the capillaries. Oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged in these capillary network beds, but also different nutrients, ions, other gases will be kind of released at this capillary level into the surrounding tissues. So those are capillaries. That's the capillary network. Here's the capillary structure. It has a very thin wall. It consists only of a simple endothelium surrounded by delicate, loose connective tissue. So they're incredibly thin walled, and they're about the diameter of a capillary is about as wide as one single red blood cell. So one single red blood cell can fit through the capillary at a time, and they can go in a row, but just one blood cell at a time. So they're incredibly small, And because their walls are incredibly thin, that allows for really easy gas exchange, nutrient exchange to go right through the walls of those capillaries. So then from the capillaries, we go back into our veins. So now we're heading back into deoxygenated blood. We need to get the deoxygenated blood back to the heart now so that the heart can pump it to the lungs to get oxygen again. So our veins bring blood back to the heart. Blood flows from your capillaries to the venules, from the venules to the small veins. All three tunics or blood vessel layers are present in small veins. They're just a lot thinner. Medium-sized veins collect blood from small veins and deliver the blood to large veins. And then large veins contain valves, which are incredibly important for getting the blood back to the heart. And I'll show a picture of the valve in a little bit. So here's, I think, the blood vessel structure of all arteries. So if we end veins, so we're going from elastic arteries to muscular arteries to arterioles to a capillary. And then when we work our way back up, we have venules, small and medium veins, and then large veins. And the large veins are the ones that will contain the valves. And in the direction of the blood flow, so think of your veins in your legs, for example. For the veins in your legs to get blood back up to the heart, they need to work really hard to get that blood back up to the heart to work its way against gravity. So your large veins have valves, which will open to allow blood to get up, and then they'll close to kind of keep the blood at that level. And then again, they'll open when we have like a burst or a push of blood forward to the heart. So these valves just kind of help keep the blood at a certain height to work its way back to the heart. Your muscles also help kind of push blood back to the heart. So you have muscles that surround these veins. And as you exercise or as these muscles contract, they also squeeze on the veins to push the blood back to the heart too. And that's just helpful as it's working its way against gravity for the blood to get back to the heart. So that's another benefit to exercise. It helps your blood flow because you're basically squeezing your veins to push the blood back to the heart. The pulmonary circulation vessels are all the vessels going to and from the lungs. So again, pulmonary circulation are the blood vessels that carry blood from the right ventricle to the lungs to get oxygen, and then back from the left atrium, back to the left atrium of the heart. The pulmonary trunk is when blood is pumped from the right ventricle towards the lungs. So the pulmonary trunk divides into those pulmonary arteries that takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And then the pulmonary veins will exit the lungs and carry that oxygen-rich blood back to the left atrium. The systemic circulation again carries blood from the left ventricle to all the tissues of the body and then back to the right atrium. Oxygenated blood from your pulmonary veins will pass from the left atrium to the left ventricle and from the left ventricle into the aorta. And then the aorta is what will pump the blood out, distribute the blood to the arteries, which will then distribute the blood to all the other parts of the body. So here's just another kind of summary of this blood flow through the circulatory system. You can see here, again, the right side of the heart is in blue, and that's because it's deoxygenated blood. You can see the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries bringing deoxygenated blood to the lungs, where they're connected to capillaries. And then those pulmonary veins bring the oxygenated blood back to the left atrium into the left ventricle. So that's the pulmonary circuit. And then the systemic circuit is the left ventricle pumping oxygenated blood out of the aorta, going to all parts of the body. You have a circulatory system in the brain, the upper limbs, the lower limbs, the renal circulation. You have digestive tract circulation. So you have capillaries that surround your digestive tract to pick up nutrients from the food you eat and then eventually bring them to the liver, which is shown here. So you have all these circulatory systems. It's kind of like a big, amazing like orchestra of events that all happens at the same time. You have a renal circulation. Your kidneys filter all the blood. We kind of put the kidneys into its own separate system called the urinary system because it can get pretty complex, but the renal circulation, you can see blood going to and from the kidneys as the kidneys filter all your blood. So we'll go through a little bit more specific parts of your aorta. The ascending aorta is what passes from the left ventricle. So it goes up and then it arches. So the aortic arch has three major arteries which carry blood to the head and your upper limbs. And then the descending aorta goes behind the heart and it extends through the thorax and the abdomen to your pelvis, and it eventually splits to go to both legs. The thoracic part of the aorta goes through the thorax region or your rib cage. So it extends through the thorax to your diaphragm. And after the aorta goes through the diaphragm, it becomes the abdominal aorta, where it extends from the diaphragm, and then it will divide at what we call the common iliac arteries. And those common iliac arteries go down to the parts of the leg. So these are some of the major arteries in the body. You can see the descending aorta is the big one traveling down the thorax and the abdomen region. When I dissected my cadaver, the woman had an aneurysm in her descending aorta. So it was ballooning out. It hadn't burst, but it was kind of interesting to see an aneurysm in the descending aorta. It was just like a big balloon in that. You can see here the aortic arch has these three major branches that bring blood supply up to the head and up to the right and left limb. If you go on and take anatomy and physiology here at Crafton or another class, you'll probably learn a lot more of these names of these arteries, and we'll go over some of these arteries names in lab too. And then the aorta splits into what we call common iliac, which just means it splits into basically branches that go down either side of the leg. So here are more branches of the aorta and how branches of the aorta travel to the liver, the stomach, the intestines. This picture here, and I'll put my laser on, shows how the descending aorta travels through a hole in your diaphragm. So this muscle right here is your diaphragm. It kind of serves as the dividing point between the thoracic, your heart and lungs above it, and then all of the abdominal organs below it. And the aorta, or the descending aorta, goes through a hole in that diaphragm. And then in the lower, in the abdominal cavity, you'll have branches called renal arteries, which take all oxygenated blood to your kidneys. And then you'll have other branches. Many times the names of these branches tell you where it's going to. So your superior and inferior mesenteric artery go to the mesentery, which surrounds your intestines. You have gonadal arteries, which go to the gonads. You have a celiac trunk artery, which is a big branch that divides into three. So a lot of different branches going to all parts of your body, organs and tissues, because they all need oxygen to function. So we need a way to get oxygen to all those organs. I guess we'll go over some of these names a little bit, or at least how it branches. So branches of the aortic arch, remember the aortic arch kind of curved a little bit on top of the heart. And then you have these three branches coming off, the brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian are those three branches off the aorta. The brachiocephalic artery is that first branch, and it will supply blood to the right side of your head and neck. The left common carotid artery is the second branch off the aortic arch, and it supplies all blood to the left side of the head and neck. And the third branch is called the subclavian, left subclavian, and it supplies blood to the left upper limbs. Your brachiocephalic then will branch into two, and I wish I had we kind of have a picture here. So your brachiocephalic artery was the first branch off the aorta, and these are the two branches off of that brachiocephalic. The right common carotid goes up the right side of the head and neck, and the right subclavian supplies the blood to the right upper limbs. So here we are looking at the right side of the neck, head and neck, and we see our brachiocephalic artery, which is the first branch off of the aortic arch, and we can see how it has this subclavian artery, which kind of is curving back down to bring blood to your right upper limb. And the common carotid artery is what goes up the side of the neck. And the common carotid artery eventually will branch into an internal and an external carotid. The external carotid artery brings blood supply to kind of the external surface of the skull, and the internal carotid artery brings blood to the inner side of the brain and skull. Within the arteries that go to the head, it's really interesting, or the brain, I should say, because they form like this circle. That's kind of cool to see. and it's called the cerebral arterial circle. And I do remember you will be labeling some of these in lab. We'll probably get through this in a couple of weeks. So we have kind of one central artery which goes up the brainstem, the basilar artery, and then it kind of branches to form what we call these communicating arteries that kind of go in a circle, and then they have branches that come off of that circle. We call this the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis. You can see all the different labels and how we label the parts of that circle. So this is kind of how your brain gets blood supply. So again, one major branch coming up from the brainstem, and then we have these branches of the circle. So that's the circle of Willis, which is kind of cool to see how your brain gets blood. And again, if you have a part of one of these arteries that's blocked, that could be problematic, because then that part of the brain would not get oxygen. If that part of the brain doesn't get oxygen, that tissue gets destroyed, and that could lead to a stroke or another sort of problem in the brain. So here we have, this is kind of a neat chart because it shows you not just a picture representation, but just the names of the arteries and what they branch to. So here we have the aortic arch, and then we have the three major branches off of the aortic arch: the brachiocephalic, left common carotid, and left subclavian. And then the little boxes just show how those arteries go on to branch, and then what part of the body, or we're kind of in the upper head and thorax region, what part of the body they supply blood to. Arteries of the upper limb. So then as we go kind of into our limbs or our arms, we have axillary arteries. And remember that word axillary or auxiliary, that always referred to the armpit. So these will be the arteries. It's a continuation of that subclavian artery, which is coming from the aorta, but the subclavian artery kind of travels along your collarbone. And then once it gets to your armpit, it just changes names to the axillary artery. And this artery supplies blood deeper to the clavicle, to the armpit. Then that axillary artery changes names to the brachial artery when it gets to the upper arm. So that's a continuation of the axillary. And this is usually where blood pressure measurements are taken. You can remember the blood pressure cuff goes around the brachial artery. The brachial artery then branches when it gets to the forearm, and it branches into the ulnar and radial arteries. The ulnar artery will travel along the pinky side, or the ulna bone, and then the radial artery travels along the radius, or the thumb side. So those are the two branches of the brachial artery, both supplying blood usually to the forearm, the hand, and then the radial artery, again, kind of where your thumb is, because it's on the radius bone side. This is usually where you can feel a pulse taken at that radial artery. So here we have the brachiocephalic artery, which is a branch from the aorta, changing names into the right subclavian, changing names into the axillary, changing names into the brachial artery, and then it splits right here into a radial and an ulnar artery. Obviously, there are more branches that come off as well, but that's kind of the main kind of nomenclature, or how it follows down the arm, with other branches coming off as well. Coming off of the abdominal aorta, so our descending aorta went through the diaphragm. We have the celiac trunk arteries supplying blood to your stomach, pancreas, spleen, liver. The upper duodenum is a part of the small intestine. And then we have the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. They will mainly supply blood to your small intestines and your colon. So your colon is the large intestine. So if you know someone with colon cancer, they have cancer of the large intestine. So these mesenteric arteries kind of are the ones giving blood supply to your small intestines and colon. And you might have a question on your lecture exam about which arteries supply blood to the stomach, pancreas, spleen, and liver. And those would be the celiac trunk arteries, because the mesenteric arteries are all giving blood supply to the intestines. Then renal arteries, that word renal always has to do with kidneys. So renal arteries supply blood to your kidneys. Hepatic arteries, the word hepatic always has that prefix. Hepa has to do with liver. So these arteries supply blood to the liver. And then we have gonadal arteries, so supplying blood to the gonads, either testes or ovaries, so testicular or ovarian arteries. We have an inferior phrenic artery, which supplies blood to the diaphragm itself. We have lumbar arteries supplying blood to your lumbar vertebra and back muscles. And then arteries of the pelvis. So our descending aorta was one coming down, and now it's going to branch into what we call common iliac arteries. So your common iliac arteries are the branches from the descending abdominal aorta, and they will divide into external and internal iliacs. So external iliacs will be one division, and then internal iliacs will be another division. Your external iliac will continue down to the legs. So your external iliac just continues down to supply blood to the legs, but the internal iliac stays in the pelvic area, supplying blood to some of your reproductive organs, the bladder, and so forth, things in the pelvis. So here are the major arteries of the abdomen and pelvis. You probably don't like this chart because it's just a bunch of words, but it's a way for you to kind of just think about the descending aorta coming down, and you can see all the different branches coming off of it, and then what each branch supplies to. And again, I know this is a lot of information, but some of it you already know, because gonadal arteries, right and left, go to the ovaries and testes. You have suprarenal arteries go to the adrenal glands, which are on top of the kidneys. I guess you don't have renal arteries here, but some of the names directly reflect what they're branching to. So kind of use the tricks in learning the names and then figuring out what they branch to. Arteries of the lower limbs. So we have the femoral arteries supplying the thigh. Popliteal arteries supplies blood to the knee. Anterior and posterior arteries supply blood then to the leg and the foot. You have fibular arteries supplying blood to the lateral leg and foot, because the fibula is on the lateral side of the lower leg. So here we have arteries of the lower limbs. You can see that our abdominal aorta is what's coming down. It's split into the common iliac, which is right here, and then it'll split again into the internal iliac, which will go to the pelvis, and the external iliac goes on to the leg. When the external iliac crosses this ligament, it's called the inguinal ligament. It's kind of a ligament that helps to stabilize your hip bone. It changes name into the femoral arteries. So the femoral artery travels down the thigh, branches to popliteal, anterior and posterior tibial arteries, a fibular artery, and then eventually we get into what we call dorsalis pedis artery, which are arteries that kind of surround the ankle. No problem, Cameron. One other thing to note about the femoral artery is a self-defense mechanism. The femoral artery, you know, if you're ever in a self-defense situation and you have a knife with you or something else that you can use to cut, is the femoral artery bleeds out extremely fast. So if you cut here, usually the person will bleed out within seconds. Not only will they bleed out, but the femoral artery, when it's cut, it actually kind of like springs back into the body. So if someone gets cut in the femoral artery, it's really dangerous because it's hard to stop the bleeding because the femoral artery kind of backtracks and retracts back into the pelvis. So to go in and to stop the bleeding, you almost have to go in and specifically take it back out. So just be really careful. My brother was in a farming accident. He's not a farmer. He just has a hobby farm and likes to raise pigs. It's kind of funny. And he was, I think, cutting down a tree and he almost cut his femoral artery. It was really scary. So self-defense, but also just be really careful never to get into a situation. If you come across someone in an accident and they're bleeding in their thigh, it's very serious if they're bleeding out or their femoral artery was cut. Yes, and also a good place to check for a pulse. Yeah, so you can check for pulses in several places on the body. You guys probably know this, even more so than I. The femoral artery, the place in the ankle, the neck, the radial artery. Yeah, just be careful with the femoral artery. We'll get through a couple more slides here, and then I think we'll stop because we still have all of Wednesday to finish. So maybe we'll try to get through veins. So veins return blood back to the heart, and the systemic circulation, blood returning to the heart, is deoxygenated. But remember, in pulmonary circulation, the veins that are returning blood to the heart are coming from the lungs. So this is the only part in the body where these veins are oxygenated. The ones that are returning the blood to the heart from the lungs are oxygenated because they're coming right from the heart where they picked up oxygen. So in pulmonary circulation, that's sometimes a good test question too, that blood returning to the heart in your pulmonary veins is always oxygenated. Then we'll kind of get through some branching of the veins. The superior vena cava, again, now when we talk about veins, we're always going to be describing veins as bringing blood or draining blood from parts of the body back into the heart. So the superior vena cava returns blood from the head, the neck, the thorax, and the right upper limbs, and it will empty into the right atrium. And the inferior vena cava returns all the blood from the abdomen, the pelvis, the lower limbs, and the inferior vena cava also empties directly into the right atrium as well. So here are the veins, major veins of the body. The branching system of the veins is really similar to your arteries, and many of them even have the same names. So the veins that are bringing blood from your kidneys, for example, are called your renal veins. You have gonadal veins, hepatic veins. So a lot of the branching and a lot of the nomenclature for the veins is similar. It's a little different coming right off the heart. The branches are a little different, but for the most part, the veins and the branching and the names are similar to the arteries. So you have an external and an internal jugular vein draining blood from the head and neck. So your external jugular vein, they both basically drain blood from the head, neck. The internal jugular vein goes a little bit more inside the skull, so you might drain some blood from the face, and they'll both empty into the subclavian veins. The subclavian veins will form the brachiocephalic veins, and the brachiocephalic veins are what kind of branch to form the superior vena cava. So if we go back to this picture, we have the superior vena cava coming out, and the two branches off the superior vena cava are those brachiocephalic veins. So here are veins of the head and neck. Again, you can see the superior vena cava coming off of the right atrium. We have a left brachiocephalic vein and then a right brachiocephalic vein. Remember, rights and lefts are always labeled in the body for how they would sit on the person, not for how we see it. So the left brachiocephalic vein is going to this person's left side of the body, and the right brachiocephalic vein goes to that person's right side of the body. Then from here, the brachiocephalic veins will form the subclavian veins, which go into the axillary and the brachial veins. So kind of a similar nomenclature as the arteries. So the veins of the upper limbs, we have brachial veins, empty into the axillary vein. We have a cephalic vein, which empties into the axillary vein and the basilic vein. We have median cubital veins, which connect to the cephalic vein near the elbow. And that's often the one that you'll shoot for if you're taking a blood sample. So here we have some of the veins. We have what we call the subclavian vein, the axillary vein, the brachial veins. We have a little bit different branches here with a cephalic vein kind of going on the outside shoulder. This medial cubital vein is often, again, one you're looking for in getting a blood sample, and then the cephalic vein. So the branches are a little bit different, but some of the names are the same for the veins. Veins of the thorax. So now working our way down, we have right and left brachiocephalic veins draining blood from the thorax back into the superior vena cava, into the heart. The azygous vein is kind of a unique one. It drains blood from the thorax directly into the superior vena cava as well. And you have internal thoracic veins, which empty into brachiocephalic veins. So just more veins branching. One thing to help you remember, intercostal veins are veins between ribs. So they drain blood from the posterior thoracic wall between your ribs. And then you have a hemiazygous vein, receives blood from the azygous vein at the left side. So here we kind of have veins of the thorax, superior vena cava, right and left. We have an accessory hemizygous, a hemizygous. So we have posterior intercostals. You can see these between ribs. All are trying to get blood, deoxygenated blood, back into the superior vena cava and back to the heart. Also shown here, you can see renal veins draining blood from the kidneys as well. So moving our way down to the abdomen and pelvis, We have the inferior vena cava. Remember, the inferior vena cava is what empties into the aorta or the atrium. So your inferior vena cava travels down the abdomen and pelvis, and it will eventually split into common iliac veins, and then common iliac veins split into external and internal iliac veins, which drain blood from the pelvis region and the lower limb. Renal veins drain blood from the kidneys. So here are major veins of the abdomen and pelvis and the branching of that. So I think I'm going to stop there and we'll have something to talk about on Wednesday. So I'm going to stop the recording